Hi, welcome to the Writing Well. Today we have Kelly McClymer. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Um, so tell us a little bit of your writing backstory.
My writing backstory, the long, boring part that we're supposed to leave out of the books. Okay, so I was born. I'm one of those people who really can say that I've been a writer for as long as I can remember,
Okay.
and I just have always liked to tell stories and read stories, and I my very first the very first time when I felt like, oh, other people might like to read my stories too, besides my little sisters who were not given a choice, was when I submitted an essay for a class. I think it was fifth grade. No, it was sixth grade, because I had a really mean teacher in fifth grade. She didn't like anything I did. So in sixth grade, I submitted a story about baking bread because my mom and I had tried this bread baking experiment that went really horribly wrong. If anyone's seen the Blob movie, that's basically what my bread looked like. And I had put it, you're supposed to put a bowl over it and let it sit there and rest. Well, my bread did not rest. It oozed out from underneath the bowl and dripped down the counter and basically tried to take over the kitchen. So my teacher wrote all these really great comments on my essay, and I after that I was hooked.
Mm. So, what was the first official thing that officially was published in an official thing?
The very first thing that was published officially was a short science fiction story called Diapers, Dishes, and Demons. And it was very surreal. I wrote it because I don't know if I really had postpartum depression, but I definitely had postpartum something with my second child. And it just felt like the world was so bleak, and there was like this little demon always making me not do the things that I knew I needed to do. So I'm like, okay, what do I do? I don't go to a therapist, goodness gracious. No. So I just wrote about it. And I was taking a graduate course in writing at the time. And my teacher said, oh, I really love this story. So I sent it out a few places. Author tip, do not market to a market that is not interested in what you have to say. So I was sending it to science fiction magazines where the demographic is teenage men,
Yeah,
who weren't interested really in postpartum demons.
right.
So I finally found the exact right market. It was a tiny little fanzine called Housewife Writers Forum. Now, doesn't that sound like the right demographic?
Yes.
It was. And that was it. What I think they paid me $15 or $20, not very much, but it was so exciting
Yeah.
because the editor wrote this nice little blurb in front of my story, and it was nice to see. It wasn't exactly a review, but it was kind of an encapsulation of what he liked about the story. And I was like,
Mm.
yes. So I kept writing.
So, how many books do you have out now?
That's a good question. I have 7 historical romance. I have 2 mystery. I have 6 young adult, 1 random romance. And then I'm working on my Evertwixt serial. So I have short stories out from that. And then I have all my short stories, all my strange Mad Mother short stories that I wrote through the years. I've published those too. So I have quite
Okay.
a few things out.
Yeah. So how has what does your writing process look like now? Let's start there
Well,
before I get
I will say right away. You know, I started writing in the days, not the days of manual typewriters, not quite that far back, not the days of quill pens, but the days of electric typewriters
Mm-hmm.
with where you had to backspace over your errors
Mm-hmm.
if you made any errors, and I always make errors. So I really appreciate this one tool that I like to recommend all the time, and that's Scrivener,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I use Scrivener
because
too. It's amazing.
it's it takes all the things that I had that were separate, like my box of index cards and my printed out manuscript and my handwritten edit pages and my file cabinets full of notes, some of which are just napkins that I scribbled a note on and threw into the filing cabinet. It takes all of that and organizes it so that what used to be a really random process is it's more organized. I won't say it's completely organized because I think that's against my nature, especially when I'm creating. But I start with Scrivener, and I usually will start writing the beginning of the book first. I usually, the beginning of the book kind of plays with the back of my mind for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll sort of ask myself, who's this character? What's going on? And then all of a sudden, I have to write the beginning of it. So then I sit down and I write the beginning of it, and then everything starts from there. I start keeping notes. I start deciding whether I like it. I decide whose point of view I'm going to be using, and all of those other things. But Scrivener
So,
first.
yeah, so would you describe yourself more as a pantser or a plotter? Or is it some combination?
Well, I once heard Tess Gerritsen, who writes thrillers. I went to see her at speak at the library, and she said something that I thought really caught it for me too. I need to know where I'm going, but I don't want to know too much.
Mm-hmm.
I like to discover things along the way. So what I do is I have created a really short, I think she described it as being like Tarzan in the jungle. You grab hold of a vine and you see there are other vines ahead of you as you're swinging forward, and you grab onto another one that works and you move your way
Okay.
through. And I really liked that. So I have read so many books on how to write and how other authors write, trying to find like the magic answer to make writing easy for me.
It's a magic answer, but it's a different answer for every single person, which is why I'm interviewing you.
Well, what I discovered, because I've been writing quite a long time, is it's a different answer every year for me, and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
every book or every project, because sometimes I know exactly where I'm going and I can sink into that story. I know the characters, and sometimes I kind of have to fight myself to get into it because I'll second guess myself, or I'll get lost in the research. I often get lost in the research, which is a bad habit, but I love it anyway. But one of the things that I do, especially in Scrivener, allows me to do this is I used to keep a big box of index cards, and I would just do one scene for each card, and I would just basically write one line. And I do that with Scrivener now. And with Scrivener, I can reorganize everything, and it's
Mm-hmm.
great.
So do
Um,
you write those one line per scene? Do you write that before or after you've written that first scene?
Almost always, I write it after because it's like a test. It's like an experiment. Am I
Okay.
going to be able to do this? Is it going to interest me? Because if that first part doesn't interest me, then I'm not going to, I don't feel like the
Right.
story is ready
Right.
yet.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. So, other than technology making all of this easier, what's changed in your process since you first started?
That's a really good question, because so much has changed and changed back and changed, again.
Right, right.
Pinning that down, the one thing that I had when I wrote my first short stories, because when I first started writing, had school and all those other things that kids have. And then when I got to college, I had college and I had a writing class. So I would always have to produce, a story for the class. So I would have those short little deadlines, but I would do it like I did all my homework. If anybody else is in college, don't do this. This is a bad habit. I would always do everything the night before. And so I learned to write stories. It's not like I wouldn't be thinking about them and making notes and everything, but I wouldn't actually write the story from beginning to end until right before I needed to show it to somebody. And this continued for a very long time, because when my daughter was 6 months old, I submitted my first short story to a science fiction convention that where they had a group of authors and editors who were going to, give you feedback. So of course I wrote that short story right before I had to submit it to the conference, and then because of that short story, I actually got invited to join a critique group with professional science fiction authors. So I was very stoked.
Yeah.
And we met once a month, and I wrote one story a month. And I always finished it the day before we would have a huge all-day Saturday meeting where we would read our stories aloud, and we would bring extra copies and share them around. And it was really, I loved that. And it was a bad habit, but I would be writing in the living room with my husband and my daughter in the room next to me with the television on and with conversation going, and it didn't stop me. It almost made it easier for me to concentrate on the short story for some reason. That between the deadline and all this other activity going on, I would get in the zone. And now I have a hard time getting in the zone with conversation going on. I need a longer stretch of time. I need people not to bother me. And I say need. It feels like I need it, but I don't know whether that's true or not, but it feels like it. And it definitely feels like it's harder for me to sink down because I used to really get into I could just sort of see my stories happening as it was going, no matter what else was going on around me. And nowadays I need headphones, and I need rituals to kind of get me there. I'm not quite sure why that is. I don't like it, but I do recommend rituals.
They're really useful, I've found, for providing structure. I'm really bad at being structured.
Scrivener, always Scrivener.
Oh, even even in Scrivener, I don't use all of the structure at all. I'm really looking forward to.
You would so laugh if you saw my files. Because I start out in the beginning, like the first third of the book, there's all these great notes and all these, story structure, scene structure things. Oh, this is what the conflict should be. And then by the time I hit the middle of the book, none of that. None of it. I'm like, oh no, I don't have time to write all of that. I'm just going to write it.
Yeah.
It works. So I keep doing it that way.
Yeah. Well, it sort of makes sense by the time you've gotten through the middle. You want to know what happens at the end already, and so you're sort of that's like when you're reading too. Like it's easier to stop and start within the first half of a book because
everything hasn't started coming together. Yes.
Yeah, it's not, and there's not like that. Oh my gosh, are they gonna die? Is the evil guy gonna kill them? What? Yeah, I read a lot of fantasy. Just like 3 bookshelves full. Yeah. Anyway, so one of the things that you do that I find really fascinating is you think a lot about gender and the heroine's journey versus the hero's journey. So explain what the hero's journey and the heroine's journey are and how they're similar and how they're different.
So culturally, we all kind of know what the difference is between the hero's journey and the heroine's journey, only we just think of it as, like what men are supposed to do and what women are supposed to do. And we don't really think of it, in that, we never think of ourselves as heroes usually. Even people who really are heroes tend not to think of themselves that way. It feels strange. But one of the things I find interesting is just as, you know, I like being a woman, but I don't like that when people look at me and say, oh, she's a woman, she can't. I really dislike that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's bad enough that I put can'ts on myself. I don't want anyone else putting a can't on me just because I happen to, you know, have 2 X chromosomes. So, and especially when I was writing in the science fiction arena, I really felt it. I felt like a lot of times my stories were dismissed because they were about female protagonists and female issues
In science fiction,
in
where
science
that's not
fiction.
very common. Yeah.
And there are some really fabulous female science fiction writers. So it's not like
Actually,
everybody was getting press.
I'm very particular about the sci-fi I read, and most of the sci-fi I read is written by women. I've noticed that. It's really an interesting thing to notice because when I'm picking a book to read, I don't look at the author. I look at whether or not it sounds like an interesting story, and it's only after they're all like sitting on my shelf that I look and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. 90% of those are by women. What? And like everyone recommends Heinlein and Asimov, and I haven't read them because the stories just don't appeal to me.
Now, see,
And
those do
I
appeal
wonder
to
if
me.
that has something to do with that heroine's journey versus hero's journey or something,
You
maybe.
know, it could be, but I definitely liked Asimov and Heinlein, and but Connie Willis and oh, I'm gonna flake on the names, but there's so many of them. Connie Willis, especially, she was the one, the science fiction author who made me realize that women could get published in science fiction writing about female issues.
Mm-hmm.
They had to be something that the male could connect to, because she had this wonderful first story about, it was kind of like a little Roomba, a combination between a Roomba and an R2D2 is how I pictured it, an
Mm-hmm.
automatic vacuum for the house that vacuumed up something she didn't want, and she had to figure out how to get it. She didn't want it to, and she had to figure out how to get it back. And I'm forgetting what the science fiction element of that story was. I don't think it was just the vacuum, but it may be, which, because it was an older story.
Yeah.
And
Well,
this is
robotics
very
has come
domestic.
a long
And
way
so the
recently. So,
heroine, that's true. The heroine's journey is seen to be somewhat domestic, whereas the hero's journey takes the hero, obviously, like Hercules and Odysseus and
right.
uh, Frodo.
Yeah.
Frodo, way out of their comfort zone, plucks them from their house and their family and sends them off to have all these
So,
adventures.
so do you have to, does a heroine's journey have to happen in a domestic setting?
Well, that's one of the questions I've been asking myself for 20 years, because I don't really like boxes. And so I sort of feel like our culture kind of, you know, has decided that it does, but I see so many individual women who challenge that and take us outside. Right now, I mean, Hunger Games, Suzanne Collins, she obviously, that is the most domestic of the heroine's journeys possible, because the only thing that Katniss wants is to take care of her mother and her sister and go back there so that she can watch over her sister and make sure
Yeah.
she's okay. She doesn't want to be a hero. She doesn't want to do any of these testing things, but she's forced to. And in being forced to, she becomes, you know, a lot stronger in her own convictions, but she's still very domestic, which I think my personal,
Yeah, well, that's
I
a
don't
really
want to
interesting way
spoil
of
it.
talking about Katniss too, because most of the, most of the advertising you see for that story for the movies is all about her, using her bow and arrow to fight people. And I think it's really interesting that you brought that up because you can have both. And like I think you can have both, and you can have a heroine's journey and a hero's journey in the same person, and it doesn't matter what gender you are. Because I think in Once Upon a Time, I think Prince Charming has a very similar domestic
Yes.
thing going on as well. Especially like I'm thinking of this one scene. It's my favorite scene in the entire in the entire Once Upon a Time TV show series. Like, it's in the first season. And if you haven't watched the first season and you're going to, then like
Oh, I
plug your
have.
ears for 30 seconds. But when he has baby Emma and he has to take baby Emma to the cupboard, and he's like fighting off all the bad guys with like his sword in one hand and his baby in the other hand, and like that to me is the perfect example of how you merge both. And Katniss is like that as well, but instead of a like there's no scene where it's clear like that. But she's doing the same thing, you know, with caring about her family, and she's like fighting off everything that's trying to attack her family using her skills as a hunter.
But one thing because I think that's great that you brought up Prince Charming in the Once Upon a Time series, because one thing you want to remember is what's his backstory. He was not raised
He
as a
was not
prince.
raised as a prince, yeah.
And all of his actions, especially in the beginning, were to protect his mother.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the king was pretty much, you know, your mom gets killed if you don't act like a prince, you know.
Yeah,
So he
yeah.
didn't really have a lot of choices. And he's always been basically much more domestic than Snow White.
I know.
Which is kind of cool.
It is kind of awesome.
The thing with Katniss, though, is if you think about it, her bow and arrow from the very beginning represents taking care of her family. She does not hunt, you know, for sport. She hunts to feed her family. And I think that's really critically the difference between the way culturally we perceive the hero's journey is he is hunting to prove himself. So he may be trying to take care of his family. That may be a secondary
motivation,
but he is trying to dominate.
He's trying to win something. He's trying to achieve some sort of reward or recognition or something like that.
And usually
like
it's
all
the
the fairy
gods.
tales with princes who have to be tested, there's like some princess that they win at the end, right?
Yeah, but she's but she's the secondary prize, being recognized as the best at something. I mean, when you think about all of the ridiculous challenges they're made to go through, when you read the originals instead of the watered down, well, the original translations. I don't read in that many languages.
Yeah. But then if you look at the I'm taking like the translated Grimm's fairy tales for reference. But like if you look at most of those Grimm's fairy tales about women, the women have to somehow figure out how to overcome the challenge to come into their own power. And it's not about recognition at all. Whereas most of the princes, they have to achieve, like they have to overdo these challenges in order to gain that recognition and to win the like prize.
Right. And one of my favorite books about this is the 45 Master Characters.
Yeah.
And I'm forgetting the author. I probably have it.
That's okay. I'll link to it in the show notes.
But one of the things she says about that is that's really true. That a heroine's journey, the heroine is going to come to recognize her own strengths. That's the important moment. She recognizes how strong and convicted she is, that she's going to have the gumption to do what she needs to do. And for the hero's journey, it's not just if he recognizes his own strength, that's not good enough. Yeah. Everyone else needs to recognize it and needs to publicly acknowledge it.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different, and it can seem subtle when you're just looking, you know, at a story like Hunger Games, because Katniss does seem so active and so. But if you really think about, and this is more likely for a heroine, if she's standing out and people are recognizing, you know, the outside public is recognizing she's something special, that's actually more dangerous. So there's even more need to crush her.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the especially the third Hunger Games book, that is almost entirely about her doing things because other people have misinterpreted her motivations. And then
or
she's
have
ended
personal agendas that they want to use her reputation to,
Right. So the
and
conflict is
yeah,
almost in it's almost between her internal, wanting to keep her family safe and these external pressures where everyone wants her to be the hero that they've turned her into. And she's like, no, I don't, that's not what I'm here for. I didn't sign up for that. I didn't sign up for it.
yeah. I mean,
You know,
they basically changed what is it? The second book, they changed the rules, right? Or is it the third book?
it's the second book is the second set of Hunger Games where it's like the weird rules because it's the special one. And then the third one is the rebellion and
Right, well, because
politics
but
and stuff.
that's a really interesting twist to the story. Is she's done all of this. She survived, so she can go back and take care of her mother and her sister. And then they up the stakes and they say, "Oh, guess what? All of you people who thought you were safe and could go home and reap the benefits of your harrowing experience, guess what? Because of Katniss, you get to come back."
Yeah.
So they try really hard to make people hate her. And yet, only through her own actions and being absolutely true to her own desire to protect her family.
Yeah.
And she has a very, very narrow view of family. Her mother, her sister, Peta, and
I don't even think PETA qualifies until like the epilogue of the third book.
I
And I
think
think he
Peta
only becomes
qualifies only because of he allowed the ending to, or actually he kind of forced the ending of book one because he would not kill her and she would not kill him. The two of them are kind of strong. So I know what you're saying. He's more like a distant cousin, but she
well, because
kind of
I'm
feels.
thinking of the part where PETA and Gale are talking about Katniss and like they're talking to each other because they both know that they both love her and that she like kind of is torn between the two of them. And they're asking each other, who's she gonna pick? And they both say that, she's gonna pick whichever one of us she thinks will help her survive. And that's really true. That's what she does.
But again, that's whichever one is going to help her take care of her mother and sister. Which
Right.
I'm.
Right.
Oh, I was going to do a spoiler. Never mind. I'm not going to say that.
um oh man, I had a really good question like 2 seconds ago and now I don't remember what it was. This happens to me all the time. Ah. Oh, I was gonna ask. Okay. So if you were writing a series, um, and you wanted to have your character have both the hero's journey and the heroine's journey over the course of the entire series, not within one book or another, would you how would you merge those two journeys or overlay them to make it work? Would you have the heroine's journey first and the hero's journey second, or the hero's journey first and the heroine's journey second, or some like weird mixture?
So I'm pretty iconoclastic. So I think I would create, uh, you know,
A
just
hybrid.
a yeah, just a journey that suited that one particular character. Um, because even within the hero's journey, they have the what was it 12 or 16 steps that Joseph Campbell laid out. But the way they approach them, does depend on their particular character, and
Right.
that's true of the heroine's journey too. I mean, some heroines literally never leave home. Um, I mean, basically, Cinderella doesn't leave home because she's still in her same town. The only thing she does is
She
leave her
moves to
her
the other side of
house.
town. Yeah, she
She moves
moves
to
her
a
house.
better place. Her
Yeah.
dress is definitely more upscale, but and in the original version, she gets to take deal with her
That's actually I
stepmother
didn't really
well.
think about that before, but like if you're gonna take one thing away from Cinderella is are not gonna meet your Prince Charming if you don't leave your house. Because she had to go to the ball. Like if she hadn't gone to the ball, she never would have met him and like that wouldn't be a story.
Oh, but she
Like
wanted to go to the
she
ball.
wanted to go to the
She
ball.
was not.
Yeah, no, she did. But
She
like
never.
it's a good
Cinderella
lesson still.
never never does not answer a call to action. She has a really interesting heroine's tale. I mean, I kind of think that the fairy tales are the original heroine's tale, because the men, the Prince Charmings in these are really more rewards than they are actual active characters. The only one I
Well,
would,
the ones
Snow White.
there are a bunch of ones, and I think a lot of these are not. I think there's this book called, I think it's called Fairy Tale Princes by Isabel Wyatt. And Isabel Wyatt has amazing retellings of fairy tales. Like, if you like fairy tales, you should go check her work
Yeah, I don't
out.
think I've checked her.
Um,
I will read
but
her
she's
name.
got a book called, I think it's called Fairy Tale Princes, and then there's one that's called King Beetle Tamer. I think it's just called King Beetle Tamer. I'll look them up and link to them. Um, and then there's also some new, they're sort of fantasy novels, but they're very much based on fairy tales that Mercedes Lackey has written in the
Mm-hmm.
500 Kingdoms series. And all of those, the Isabel Wyatt ones and the Mercedes Lackey ones, all of those, the princes in
Right.
those stories, they get tested. And they have to have the same character qualities that you are used to having as the default for like a Snow White or a Cinderella. They have to be kind, they have to be generous, they have to be like, there's in the first of Mercedes Lackey's series is called, I think it's called The Fairy Godmother. And it's about a woman who's supposed to be a Cinderella, but the prince is like 2 years old, and so instead she ends up becoming an apprentice fairy godmother. And at one point, her job as the fairy godmother is to test these princes who are going to like on this quest. And she does the same, like, looking like an old woman begging for an apple that you are used to seeing in the traditional fairy tales, but she's making a guy stop and help her. And usually in the stories, you see a woman stop and help another woman. And the guys are usually stopped and helped by animals.
Exactly. Animals,
Which,
especially.
yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. And so I guess in my head, I'm more used to these strong princes having their own stories where they're getting help and they're helping people along the way. And it's almost always the youngest son who wins because he's like the kindest and the least arrogant and selfish.
So one
So,
of my beliefs after doing the work that I've been doing on my Evertwixt series is that these stories are very, very old,
yeah.
and they go through iterations and they get changed, uh, to fit whatever current culture is. So if you think about when the Disney Cinderella and Snow White and uh,
The original Cinderella, not the
Rapunzel's.
one from last year. The one from last year is amazing, by the way. If
Well,
you haven't,
there's a 1950 one with Leslie Ann Warren that's pretty amazing too. Cinderella is pretty strong, and the
is that
prince is pretty cool too.
there's also Julie Andrews, Rogers and Hammerstein one, which
Yeah,
is
that's that one. Yeah,
yeah.
I think I can't remember.
They've redone that one a lot of times.
Well, Cinderella is one of the most popular, which makes me think it's probably one of the oldest, which I think is interesting to have one of the oldest folk tales have a woman at the center. So I have my own personal theories about
A
that.
woman overcoming abusive domestic life too. You know?
Well, basically, yes, escaping from, but culturally, she's changed a lot. And in the 50s, a woman's role was more to be in the background and be patient, but not be a complete doormat. But still, I mean, the fairy godmother comes in because Cinderella, on her own devices, despite what she does, because she's certainly not a doormat. She
No.
she does all the tasks she's supposed to do. She does them cheerfully. She makes her own dress so that she can attend. And if it wasn't ripped up, she could attend, but now she's stuck with this ripped up dress. And then the fairy godmother comes in and gives her her pumpkin carriage and her big fancy dress that I always wanted a dress like that. And the glass slippers. I always wanted glass slippers like that
Well,
when
and
I was little.
there are so many different versions of the written ones too. Like, um,
I think
Oh, there's like
I
a
think almost
dress of
every culture,
silver and a dress of gold and a dress of um
and sometimes the slippers are red,
yeah.
which and not glass. So I think the glass slipper was a
I think
Charles
it
Perrault version.
yeah. When
He wrote it in
I
the
read a different
1600s.
version that wasn't a Snow White or a Snow White
A
Cinderella
Disney.
at all, but it had a woman who was like working as a scullery maid, but she had these three dresses from her fairy godmother. And so she like did all of her work cleaning the pots and pans, and then she would go attend the feast as this mysterious fancy lady, and nobody could recognize her because she wasn't wearing her
Yeah,
rags
that sounds
anymore.
familiar to me. I forget which one that was too. But there's, I mean, there are all sorts of versions.
Yeah,
You know, Egypt has one.
yeah,
So, some of them, because people actually study this. This is actually a university subject,
yeah,
and
yeah. I took a class in it in high school. Yeah,
and it's really interesting. It's like there are rules for whether it fits into the Cinderella
the Cinderella
or
archetype or
not.
not. Yeah,
And some of them I'm like, I don't see how that fits. But then I read the rules, it's like, okay, but I think it's kind of squishing it a little bit. But it is interesting to read them all, you know, and see the different variations in the story. You really see how culture shapes that. It's
yeah.
one of the things when I'm really looking for some, I'm really looking for some very original. So I'm trying to weed down to the really original stories that were told before things started to get written down. And I went, you know, was looking for some from Africa, and I was a little bit shocked that the most of the stuff I could find easily had a Christian overlay. And I'm like, well,
Hmm.
you know, Christianity's been around 2,000 years, and Africa and Africans have been around a whole lot more than that. So I'm guessing these are not. This is an overlay on this, you
There's
know,
a really
original
interesting
tale.
book called, I think it's called Fairy Tale Rituals. I just checked on it's on my shelf. It's called Fairy Tale Rituals, and
Good. I'm looking for
it's this
texts.
guy's written it, and it's a look at a few different um, fairy tales, and he's looking at it through the lens of what that fairy tale meant symbolically in the pagan pre-Christian
Oh, cool. I want to
world.
look at that.
So
I
there's a
haven't
lot
had a
of
chance.
like and he talks about different archetypes of people, like the Fey seductress who appears as a child, and then the king is like, we're gonna adopt her, and the queen is like, sure, whatever. And
They
like
have a male
and
version
then
of that
and
too.
then yeah, so he was talking about essentially he was talking about Snow White being in one of these original versions of Snow White. Snow White is actually adopted by the king and queen,
I
and
think
it's
for
the
Rapunzel, that's
king
the case
who
too.
decides that, and then when the king is dead and Snow White has grown up, like she's really a fairy changeling, and so that's why she's so beautiful to so many different types of people. um and that's what causes that tension between the queen and Snow White, um is that the queen can't compete, and the queen didn't ever really want her there in the first place. But because she was a fairy changeling, Snow White could basically, without even trying,
Doesn't that change
be
the whole
perfectly
story?
attractive to everyone. Like someone who's a king and someone who's a peasant are not going to be attracted to the same type of woman, or they wouldn't have been back then anyway. Maybe they
I don't
would be
know.
now. I don't know. Um, and so it's really it's an interesting book
It
because
completely
he
changes it because it
yeah,
makes her attractiveness supernatural and somewhat unfair.
right, right, yeah.
Yeah, no, I like all of the different cultural twists and turns because it really makes me think about these stories a little bit more and think about what the actual story is trying to say.
Hmm.
I mean, we all have to deal with these things. I mean, well, I
Yeah,
don't know. There's probably some people, maybe whoever's, you know, whoever's like the top model right now never has to deal with other women who are more attractive than her. I don't know. She probably thinks she does. But most of us have to deal with.
well, most of us don't have any sort of real perception of what other people think of our physical appearance. Like whatever it is that
Yes.
other people think, our opinion is always going to be worse than everybody else's opinion.
Well, and fictionally, fictionally and culturally, that's encouraged. Like
Yeah.
men are encouraged to think highly of their own abilities and speak highly of their own abilities, where in our culture, women are not. Women are dinged for it. I mean, just picture if Cinderella were to say, "Well, I'm so beautiful, they're jealous of me." We would not think as well of her. Be like, no, they just treat you badly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's funny too, because like if you read the descriptions of the they're called the ugly stepsisters for a reason, right? Like they are jealous of her beauty, and they're jealous that no matter how hard they try to fit into whatever their modern for them in the world of this story,
Yes.
whatever the fashion is, whatever like makeup or hairstyles or colors of fabric are in, the ugly stepsisters are always going to be less beautiful than Cinderella, because Cinderella has this inner beauty, which is something actually, Rachel Ritchie, I had her on my book club um, about a year ago, maybe a little bit more than a year ago. I guess it would have been May 2015. And she wrote a book called The Beauty Thief. And it's like a fairy tale, but it's the princess, a thief steals her physical beauty, like literally. And love brings back her inner beauty, but she still has to steal back her physical beauty to go with it. But she
Yeah,
has
no,
to
I
like
read that. Yeah.
accept that it's going to be lost. And it's a really, really wonderful story. It's well written. I loved it. And she just came out with her new book. But that is a really, really interesting take on a fairy tale, where you have to have both the inner beauty. If you have the inner beauty, then you're going to be more beautiful than anyone else. And that's really similar to a lot of like personal development people, and they all say, you have to be confident. And what they really mean by you have to be confident is you have to be comfortable being yourself, no matter what the appearances are.
But
And
again,
that like
that
self-confidence, it's an
is
inner
more for the
strength
heroine
that
than the
comes.
hero. We don't tell the
Yeah,
hero he only has to be confident in himself or in his own inner beauty. We tell that he has to be able to save the entire town and not break a sweat, which is a
right,
little unfair.
right. It is unfair, and I think it's important to start to rebalance that, and to have both both sides of things. And like, I don't know, yeah, this is fascinating to me, because it helps me think about story structure in a more big picture way. And then I can realize, okay, this particular story has this theme, and this is why, and this is how it's working. And that helps me with the little details,
And
and
I
it
think you
helps me
always
figure
have
out
to
how
be
to do the
careful
descriptions and stuff.
for people who are listening and thinking, oh, I can tell my story anyway. Um, you have to remember that your readers have certain expectations. So if you're gonna just trample all over them, your readers are not likely to appreciate it. So you do have to keep in mind expectations, and you can warp them and you can twist them and you can turn them upside down and shake them, but you do have to acknowledge what your readers' expectations are going to be. And some of the best writers, in my opinion, are the ones who completely understand what the reader's expectations are and use them to create a story that takes the reader somewhere they never would have gone otherwise.
That's a really interesting way of talking about the power of story too,
I mean, I
right?
think
Like
just
you
to
can
go
you can
back
take
to
your reader
Hunger,
expectations and build a story that takes the reader on the transformation from one worldview to another.
but you do it through character. You
Yeah,
definitely don't do it through lecture.
obviously. Otherwise, it wouldn't
All
be a
my books start
story.
out as lecture, and then I have to transform them to an actual journey. Well, they don't start, not, I shouldn't say lecture, but narrative, a lot of telling. then I have to say, okay, I just told that. Now how do I show it? But I do want to warn anyone who's like, oh, I can tell. I don't have to pay attention to Campbell's hero's journey or any of those other
No,
structures
no,
that people have
it's the
studied.
structures are there for a reason because they work. And they've been working for millennia. But it's interesting to think about how to mix and match them, sort of. I already have wheels turning in the back of my head right now for my science fiction serial about this. So yeah, thank you. This is exactly the kind of conversation that is really, really good for fueling your creative well. Do you find that? Is that
That's
one of the
very
reasons
true.
why you do so much research? Do you get lost in the research because it's inspiring?
Because it takes me places. In my imagination, it takes the story somewhere where I hadn't expected to go, and that's exciting. I'm like, oh, I can do this, and that will make perfect sense. And so it takes me outside of my own little, internal box and
Mm-hmm.
helps me go other places. Now, sometimes I go too far down and I get confused, and then I have to come back. And I can get too involved in research, but I've written down several of the names that you've given me because I want to go check them out. I'm really, really looking more into the fairy tale history and etymology and research. And I mean, there's so many ways that they're starting to learn how to pin down, how old these stories are. And
Yeah.
it just amazes me when I'll see something written and that will indicate that the story, oh, it must be, 1,000 years old. And I'm like, I'm thinking 10,000, if not older than that.
Yeah.
So I'm looking into history and prehistory. And I just saw, I was on Flipboard, flipping through some articles, and I saw an interesting, in one of the caves in France, where they, the famous one, they
Mm-hmm.
actually just discovered a painting, a cave painting of an actual live volcano eruption. And it had been painted over or drawn over with some other,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess I don't know how they discovered it. I didn't read that far into it. And so obviously someone came back to the cave, or in my imagination, obviously, someone came back to the cave and is describing what they saw with, vivid red spouts and all of
Mm-hmm.
this other, and that was how we told stories to each other before we had language. So, I mean, before we had written language. So I
Yeah.
think, I just think story is our origin, and I find it really fascinating to push it as far as I can push it. But fortunately, fictionally, so I'm not like the poor historians who actually have to have facts to back up their.
That's one of the nice things about fantasy versus science fiction. Is science fiction, you have to actually do some research and make sure that your facts are right.
Well, fantasy in some ways, people say that, but fantasy is almost harder because in science fiction, and this isn't true of all science fiction, but science fiction, if they have the facts right, they don't have to get the emotional, personal facts right. They don't have to get people right. With fantasy, you have to get people right. If you don't have the people right, no one will buy your world, no matter
I
how well
think
you
if you don't
develop
have
it.
the people right, nobody's going to read your book, no matter what kind of a book it is.
In science fiction, people are more generous because if the
Maybe
idea is cool
this is
enough,
why I
that's what
don't
they're
like
looking at.
the male science fiction classics very much. Because the people
Well,
aren't that interesting. I mean, that's an overgeneralization. It's not
it
entirely
is, and
true, but
it's also an evolution thing because in the very beginning, when science fiction started, they probably needed to really have the people element. I mean, Wells had
I mean, I'm
tremendous
thinking
story.
about Dune, and Dune is all about the people. Dune is all about the people, and it's fascinating, and so is
But Dune
Lord of
is
the
fantasy.
Rings.
I consider Dune more fantasy than science fiction. I know other people consider it more science
It's science
fiction.
fiction.
And I have my feelings about that, but yeah. But I think probably the science fiction I like most is a lot more streamlined than Dune. Dune was more than I wanted to get into. I mean, maybe because it just felt like I was stuck on a desert and that's the last thing I wanted to ever be,
Yeah.
which is to his credit.
Yeah, but it's a really interesting desert, and it's not the sort of like most people don't live in deserts. Like
No.
most of the world is not desert. Most of
So
the
the
world
type
is
of
something
characters
else.
who
So it's really interesting to get
survive and
to
thrive
know.
there, yes, they
Yeah,
have very interesting traits.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because I just read that in where they think the cradle of our civilization, of our species, was in Africa, there's still a small tribe that lives exactly the way people lived back then.
Hmm.
Um, and I was reading the article and I noticed there was sort of a fascination about that because they're
Hmm.
basically hunter gatherers. They don't travel more than 20 miles outside of their sphere, and
Yeah,
they reject all um, of the outside technology's influence. They're just not interested. And yet people are fascinated by that and yet very uncomfortable. Why would you not want our great thing? And I know I feel that way about
yeah,
when I drive through Amish country. It's like I kind of admire people who've decided, they don't want to have TVs and they don't want to have cars and they don't want to have this, but yet I can't I can't imagine choosing to live like that either.
yeah, yeah. There was a really interesting, oh, I can't remember what it was anymore, but it was like a anthropology book that I was reading. Um, and they were talking about this tribe, and they were well, they were gatherers really more than hunters. And they were talking to them and like writing down, documenting their history and stuff. And this tribe is like, well, why would you do all of this work all the time when you could just wander around and hang out and have fun? And like there's everything you need is just like right there on the ground just for you. Like it was a
It's
completely like they're like you work so hard to get all of this freedom, but you could just have this freedom if you lived like we do. And
and
it was
there's
really
there's an
fascinating stuff.
uncomfortable truth to that. It's like the
Yeah.
people who focus on living in the now, which has always been very difficult for me. I don't even really live in this world. A lot of times in my head I'm a million other places,
Right.
and yet sometimes when I practice meditation or I'm doing my yoga, I get, you really, there's an illusion that you can control the future,
Hmm.
if you do all of these things. And I'm still superstitious about some things and it cracks me up. It's like whenever I will say something, and I'll be like, oh, I wish I hadn't said that because it might come true. I'll say knock wood and I'll knock wood. I don't
Yeah.
actually believe knocking wood is going to change any outcome, but I still do it. And it's interesting to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
I'm not as logical a creature as I like to think I am.
None of us are. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
I learned a lot and I have a lot of good ideas now.
I hope
hopefully,
everyone who watches
hopefully
does.
everyone does. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It was